Welcome to the series of Driftaway Tales. Let's begin the story. Chapter 1. The Clock Strikes Oddly. The village of Willowbrook had always been a place where time seemed to stroll rather than march. Clocks ticked softly behind lace-curtained windows. Roses climbed around garden gates. Even the church bell had a lazy chime that drifted over the fields as if reluctant to disturb the peace. It was on such a mild spring morning that Miss Jane Marple, spinster of St. Marymead now, lodging with her old friend Mrs. Weatherby, first heard of the trouble that would soon stir this sleepy place. She was sitting on the vicarage green, knitting something pale blue and mysterious, when young Lydia Trent, the Weatherby's maid, came down the lane waving a telegram envelope. "Beg pardon, miss," Lydia said breathlessly, "but this were delivered to the wrong house. It says Mr. Harold Kemp, Clockmaker, Willowbrook High Street. Only I opened it before I looked at the name." "Oh dear, I hope that isn't a crime," Miss Marple smiled. "Accidents with telegrams are rarely criminal, my dear, though they do sometimes lead to very curious consequences." "What does it say?" Lydia hesitated. "Then read. Delivery confirmed, timepiece ready. Urgent that it remains set for noon Thursday. H.M. Timepiece," murmured Miss Marple. "That's a rather theatrical way of saying clock. How interesting." By afternoon, the whole village knew that Harold Kemp's workshop blinds were still drawn, though he usually opened at dawn. Kemp was a neat, precise man of 50 with spectacles that flashed like the glass faces of his clocks. He had repaired everything from the church tower mechanism to Mrs. Dalrymple's ridiculous gilt alarm clock shaped like a cat. Yet today his door remained bolted. Miss Marple, moving at her usual unhurried pace, decided on a call. It was, after all, respectable concern rather than nosiness, though Willowbrook made little distinction between the two. The air smelled faintly of linseed oil and metal polish as she knocked on the small green door marked HKEMP Clockmaker. No answer. Through the side window she glimpsed the dim interior. Rows of ticking clocks, sunlight glinting off pendulums and, alarmingly, a figure slumped over the workbench. "Dear me," she whispered. "That looks very like Harold Kemp himself." Within minutes the constable was fetched. Sergeant Willis, a large man whose boots squeaked disapprovingly on polished floors, forced the door. The little bell above it jingled gaily. Absurdly cheerful, Kemp was indeed there, head resting on folded arms. A spilled mug of tea had formed a brown halo around his sleeve. The air smelled faintly of almonds, St. Miss Marple recognized, with a chill memory of Aunt Lavinia's unpleasant end in 1898. "Looks peaceful enough," Willis said, frowning. "Doctor says heart, maybe. Fellow was getting on." "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured, though heart seldom spill tea, and fall forward neatly between two ticking mantel clocks. "And the smell surely not." From his polish, Willis sniffed uncertainly. "Smells like marzipan. Must have had a bun." But Miss Marple's eyes had wandered to a wall clock whose pendulum beat with tireless precision. Its hands pointed to 12:30, though her own small wristwatch, always reliable, showed barely 11:15. Every other clock in the shop agreed with her watch. Only that one, a handsome mahogany piece by Harrington and Sons, insisted on the wrong hour. The telegram's words fluttered back to her. "Remain set for noon Thursday." She said nothing aloud. One learns, in a lifetime of village life, that silence often reveals more than questions. That evening, the news spread from cottage to cottage like dandelion fluff on the wind. "Poor Mr. Kemp, passed in his sleep," sighed Mrs. Weatherby as she poured tea for Miss Marple. "Such a tidy man, too, and to think he had no family." "Not quite," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "He had a niece in London, Miss Phyllis Dane, I believe. Came down last month. Pretty, brisk little thing, fond of motorcars." "Indeed she was," said Mrs. Weatherby. "I saw her driving the dreadful red one that nearly ran over the vicar's chicken." Lydia, hovering by the door, said shyly, There's talk she'll be back tomorrow for the funeral arrangements, and that she's the only heir. Miss Marple nodded. I dare say she will arrive promptly, perhaps even a trifle too promptly. She slept uneasily. The faint tick of her bedside clock seemed to echo Mr. Kemp's workshop. At midnight she awoke suddenly, certain she had heard another sound, 3 slow strokes of the church bell. But the bell only struck the hour once at 12. Strange. Next morning the coroner's verdict was brisk: natural causes, pending analysis. No autopsy yet. The doctor was certain enough of heart failure. Yet Miss Marple noticed his hesitation before signing. He had caught the same ominous scent. Phyllis Dane arrived just after noon in the red motorcar. She was slim, fashionable, and carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had learned early to manage men. She insisted on seeing her uncle's premises. The constable, uncertain, allowed her under supervision. Miss Marple, by some happy accident, happened to be arranging church bazaar posters nearby. From the doorway she observed Phyllis run her gloved fingers along the mantel clocks, pause at the one that showed 12:30, and discreetly turn it back an hour. No one else seemed to notice, but Miss Marple saw it as clearly as if it had been written on a chalkboard. That afternoon she paid a call on the vicar, Reverend John Tudor, a gentleman whose patience with parish gossip was considered saintly. She asked casually about the Clockmaker. He was a good fellow, said the vicar, though lately troubled. Spoke of money missing from his accounts, a partnership gone wrong, perhaps. He mentioned time running out, which I took for a metaphor. Or a message, Miss Marple said softly. The vicar looked puzzled. Do you think his death was? I think, she said, that it is very odd for a clockmaker to die surrounded by clocks that all tell the wrong time in exactly one case, and for his niece to correct it the moment she enters. Good heavens, Miss Marple, what could that mean? She smiled faintly. That time quite literally was the instrument of his death. That night, rain swept across Willowbrook. In her small bedroom, Miss Marple wrote a list in neat handwriting. Telegram urgent, keep clock at noon Thursday. Death occurred Wednesday morning. Clock showing 12:30. Smell of bitter almonds. Niece alters clock. Below she added a line in parentheses. Who gains from time standing still. Then she folded the paper carefully into her diary, turned down the lamp, and listened to the gentle rain mingling with the endless ticking from somewhere in the dark. Each tick seemed to whisper a name she had not yet learned and a question she would soon answer. Chapter 2. The Girl in the Red Motorcar. The following morning dawned pale and misty, with the sort of drizzle that hung in the air rather than fell. The rain had washed the streets of Willowbrook to a quiet gleam, and the shop fronts stood shuttered like weary faces. Miss Marple took her breakfast slowly, one careful spoon of porridge at a time, while Mrs. Weatherby read aloud the latest from the Morning Gazette. Noted clockmaker dies suddenly, she announced. Doctor attributes death to heart failure. No suspicious circumstances. Well, that settles it, I suppose. Miss Marple smiled mildly. Settled things have a curious habit of coming loose again, my dear, particularly when timepieces are involved. Before Mrs. Weatherby could inquire further, the low hum of an engine rose outside. A gleaming red motorcar drew up in front of the house, an expensive model quite out of keeping with Willowbrook's cobbled modesty. Phyllis Dane emerged, her dark curls escaping a silk scarf, eyes hidden behind fashionable tinted glasses. She knocked, politely enough, but with the air of someone unaccustomed to waiting. Mrs. Weatherby, I was told Miss Marple might be staying with you. Miss Marple appeared in the doorway, hands folded neatly. Indeed she is. Won't you come in, Miss Dane? Phyllis accepted tea, but declined scones. I only wanted to thank you for your kindness yesterday, she said, though her tone was cool. Uncle Harold thought highly of you, I believe. Not so highly as of his clocks, perhaps, said Miss Marple gently. They rarely disappoint, whereas people sometimes do. That earned a brief flicker of a smile, or perhaps irritation. Phyllis glanced at the mantel clock, which ticked serenely toward 10. I suppose there will be an inquest, she said. Though I hope not. Uncle hated fuss. I imagine he disliked disorder of any kind, Miss Marple said. Did he seem troubled recently? Phyllis hesitated just a fraction. Not that I know of. He was a worrier, always over his bills, his watch orders. But he had no enemies, if that's what you mean. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Enemies are rather dramatic things. I prefer to think of grievances. They're quieter, but last much longer. After the young woman left, Mrs. Weatherby sighed. She's a stylish creature, but there's something brisk about her grief, don't you think? Efficient grief, Miss Marple murmured. The kind that leaves the heart tidy, but the conscience in disarray. That afternoon, Miss Marple took her knitting to High Street and seated herself on the bench opposite the late Mr. Kemp's shop. From there she could observe the comings and goings under the unassailable excuse of fresh air. A few villagers passed by, whispering, the grocer, the postmistress, young Peter Wixie errand boy. But the door of the clockmaker's shop remained firmly shut, its green paint already dimmed by rain. Around 2 o'clock, Sergeant Willis appeared, coat collar up, a man determined to look official in damp weather. Morning, Miss Marple. I suppose you've heard the doctor's report. Nothing to it. We'll close the file tomorrow. How sensible, she said. I imagine Miss Dane will appreciate that. Willis grunted. She's efficient. That one. Already talking about selling the place. Says she's got a beer from London. A fellow who deals in antiques. Indeed, Miss Marple looked mildly interested. I wonder how quickly she received the offer. Hard to say. She was writing letters this morning at the inn. Business. Letters, she told the landlady. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Did you happen to notice what time she arrived at the shop yesterday? Willis frowned. Around 12:30, I think. Why? Oh, only that your constable found poor Mr. Kemp at 11. One does so dislike coincidences involving time. The sergeant looked uncomfortable. You think she had something to do with it? I think, said Miss Marple, that the truth often hides in plain sight, or in this case, on the face of a clock. That evening, as the rain lifted and the sun set weakly behind the church spire, Miss Marple made her way to the inn, where Phyllis was staying. She found the young woman at a corner table, writing on hotel stationery, cigarette burning forgotten, beside her teacup. My dear, Miss Marple said, I hope I'm not intruding. Phyllis looked up quickly. Not at all. I was just writing to my solicitor. Miss Marple seated herself. How tiresome legal matters must be after such a shock. You'll forgive an old woman's curiosity, but were you close to your uncle? Phyllis exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke. Close enough. He helped me once years ago, when I was in trouble. I owed him a debt, I suppose. Ah, Miss Marple said gently, debts are complicated things. They can tie people together long after affection has faded. There was a pause. A carriage clattered past outside. Phyllis's hand trembled as she stubbed out her cigarette. He wasn't kind, she said suddenly. Not really. Everyone thought him gentle, but he could be cruel, in tidy ways. He kept records of every shilling he lent, every word said in anger. I thought I'd escaped that sort of precision. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And yet you came back. Phyllis gave a bitter little laugh. He asked me to. Said he wanted to change his will, to make amends. But when I arrived, he barely spoke to me. Only muttered about clocks and appointments. I think he meant to cut me off entirely. Miss Marple's eyes were mild, but steady. Perhaps he did, my dear. Or perhaps someone persuaded him otherwise. Phyllis's expression shuttered. You talk as if. I talk, Miss Marple interrupted softly, as one who has seen many good. People forget themselves over the smallest things. A bit of pride here, a little fear there. It adds up. You know, she rose, smiling. Good night, Miss Dane. I do hope you sleep soundly. But Phyllis did not. Late that night, The innkeeper's wife told Mrs. Weatherby that the young lady had been seen leaving in her motor car around midnight and returning near dawn. No one knew where she went, but when she came back her gloves were smudged with oil. The next day brought the village market, a bright bustle of baskets and chatter beneath fluttering awnings. Miss Marple, ostensibly shopping for turnips, drifted toward the blacksmith's stall where the church sexton, old Mr. Biddle, was mending a watch chain. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said cheerfully. "You've heard, no doubt. Doctor's changed his mind. There'll be a post-mortem after all. Seems the tea Mr. Kemp drank contained cyanide." "Cyanide," Miss Marple repeated quietly. "That does explain the omens." The sexton nodded. "They say it was hidden in sugar." "Terrible thing." Miss Marple's gaze fell upon a small parcel wrapped in brown paper on the table beside him. It was stamped HKEMP Willowbrook. "And this?" she asked. "Picked it up from the post office this morning. Addressed to me, oddly enough, but sent before he died. Look, he'd written for the vicarage clock. He must have finished the repair." She unwrapped the paper carefully. Inside lay a small brass gear, bright as new, and a folded note. "Deliver with care. Time is not as simple as it looks." Miss Marple stared at the gear, her mind spinning faster than any clockwork. A telegram demanding a specific hour, a niece arriving exactly at that hour, a death neatly misjudged by half an hour. Time, indeed, was not as simple as it looked. That evening, she sat once more by her window, diary open. Under her list she added a single new line. 6. Death confirmed by wrong time, purposefully delayed, and beneath that, a quiet conclusion forming in her gentle, looping script: motive, inheritance, method, poison. Mechanism, the clock. The rain had ceased. A silver moon hung above the church tower. Somewhere down the lane, a red motorcar started its engine, then faded into the night. Miss Marple folded her diary and smiled to herself, a smile of someone who already sees the end of the pattern, though the threads have only begun to tighten. Chapter 3. The hour that never struck. The morning after the discovery of poison dawned bright and deceptively cheerful. Sunlight spilled across the cobbled lanes of Willowbrook, turning every puddle into a patch of sky. But beneath that calm blue surface, whispers moved like eels in the shallows. The clockmaker, it was now said, had been murdered. And in a village like Willowbrook, where everyone knew everyone's tea preferences and ailments, murder was not merely shocking, it was thrilling. Miss Marple, however, looked neither shocked nor thrilled. She looked thoughtful. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap. She sat in the Weatherby's sunny parlour, listening to the faint hum of bees in the garden and the louder hum of Mrs. Weatherby's indignation. "To think of such wickedness here in our village," Mrs. Weatherby exclaimed. "I always said that man's niece was too modern for her own good. Imagine racing about in that car when her uncle lay scarcely cold." "Modernity," said Miss Marple mildly, "isn't necessarily wicked. But it does make one impatient with old-fashioned obstacles, such as honesty." Mrs. Weatherby blinked. "You don't really think she—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that time is at the heart of this. Poor Mr. Kemp's time ended, quite literally, half an hour later than it should have. And that error, if one may call it, that benefited someone. By mid-morning, Sergeant Willis came pounding up the garden path, hat askew and expression troubled. Miss Marple, you've heard about the autopsy. Cyanide, plain as daylight. And there's more. The post office got record of a telegram sent from London 2 days before the death, signed HM. We traced it. No one by those initials at the address. False name. How inconvenient, said Miss Marple. And yet most convenient for the murderer. Willis sighed. The niece is staying put for now. But the inspector's coming from Market St. Clair this afternoon. He'll want statements. I imagine he will, said Miss Marple. And he'll be delighted to know that your local clock expert left behind a riddle. Later that day, the vicar, Reverend Tudor, invited Miss Marple to tea to discuss the note that had come with the brass gear. The vicarage was a cool, book-lined place that smelled faintly of dust and old lavender. The note lay upon the table between them. The words "time" is not as simple. It looks glinting faintly in the sunlight. "It sounds like a sermon title," said the vicar, brow furrowed. But what could he have meant by it? Miss Marple traced the edge of the note with one gloved finger. "I think, my dear, that he was warning us. Not about philosophy, but about murder." The vicar looked startled. "You believe he suspected?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that Mr. Kemp realized someone was tampering with time itself, or rather, with the record of it. That telegram ordering a clock to remain set for noon Thursday wasn't idle talk. It was an instruction." She leaned back, eyes half closed. Suppose someone wished to poison Mr. Kemp at a particular hour, an hour that would later seem different. If every other clock showed 11, while one clock, the one by which the police judged the time of death, showed 12:30, it would alter the story entirely. The vicar stared. So his killer needed half an hour to disappear, perhaps to establish an alibi. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "A most ingenious method, don't you think? Murder committed by adjustment of mechanism." That afternoon, Inspector Graves arrived from Market St. Clair, a compact man with a neat moustache and the distrust of amateurs. He called at the Weatherby's drawing room, where Miss Marple awaited him with tea already poured. "Miss Marple," he said courteously, but briskly, "I understand you have theories." "I have observations," she corrected pleasantly. "Theories are for those who hurry." He accepted tea despite himself. "We've confirmed the telegram was sent from Paddington Station kiosk, the handwriting's disguised. Miss Dane admits she was in London that day, but claims she knows nothing of it." Miss Marple smiled. "It's so easy to forget little errands in London. I once forgot an umbrella, and it poured all the way home. Perhaps she forgot a telegram, or wished us to think she had." The inspector frowned. "You think she did it?" "I think she understands clocks. And she understands money. A dangerous combination." "Money," he repeated. "Yes. I made a few inquiries. Mr. Kemp was due to renew a business loan with a Mr. Ferris, a London dealer who, curiously enough, has been courting Miss Dane. If Mr. Kemp died before signing, the debt would vanish, leaving her inheritance clear." Graves whistled softly. "That would do it. Still, we need proof." "Proof," Miss Marple said, "is often a matter of timing." That evening, as the inspector made arrangements for a search, Miss Marple took a quiet walk along the lane that led past the churchyard. The first stars appeared, trembling in the dusk. She paused beside the stone wall, where the vines had begun to bloom, listening to the faint ticking of the church clock. Except it wasn't ticking. The hands were frozen at 11:30. Inside the porch she found Mr. Biddle, the sexton, polishing the brass pendulum. "Evening, ma'am. Sorry for the noise. The old mechanism's been sticking." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "Just as it stuck the night before Mr. Kemp died." He blinked. "Why, yes. Funny you know that. I make it my business to know time. Mr. Biddle, was anyone in the tower that night?" The old man scratched his head. "Come to think of it, I heard a motor around midnight. Figured it was that red car of the niece's. Lights stopped near the gate. Didn't see anyone, though." Miss Marple's heart gave a tiny, decisive flutter. A car at midnight, a clock stopped at 11:30, and a death misjudged by an hour. "Thank you, Mr. Biddle," she said softly. "You've just told me when the hour that never struck began." When she returned home, she found Inspector Graves waiting with new information. "We searched her car," he said. "Found traces of oil and something else, powder from a jeweler's brush, the sort used in cleaning clock gears." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Then I think we may conclude Miss Dane's midnight journey was not for scenic purposes." She opened her diary and laid it flat before him. Across the neat lines of script were her notes. Telegram, clock set for noon Thursday. Death at 11 Wednesday. clock showing 12:30, car seen at midnight. Don't you see, she said gently. She used the church clock as her alibi. She altered it first, moved it forward, then she killed him around 11. When his shop clock matched the false church time, she reset that too. Everyone believed he died half an hour later than he did. That gave her time to drive to the vicarage, ring the bell, and establish her innocent whereabouts. Graves stared, but why the telegram? To ensure the clock stayed wrong until she needed it, said Miss Marple. She likely feared Kemp might repair it, hence the message, keep it set for noon. Ingenious, really, murder by misdirection. The inspector leaned back, impressed despite himself. You've a mind like a mousetrap, Miss Marple. Oh dear, she said, smiling faintly, I much prefer cats. They catch what they need without looking proud about it. Outside, the church bell began to strike the hour, correctly this time. Its deep notes rolled over the village like slow truth returning home. Miss Marple listened, eyes half closed. There, Inspector, the hour that never struck us finally found its voice. Graves stood. We'll arrest her tomorrow. Yes, said Miss Marple softly, gathering her knitting. Tomorrow will do nicely. One mustn't rush justice. It keeps better overnight. Chapter 4. The Clockmaker's Confession. The next morning dawned cool and pale. The kind of English spring day that looked peaceful but smelled faintly of rain. The village of Willowbrook stirred itself slowly, shutters creaking open, cats stretching on doorsteps, and Mrs. Weatherby's kettle whistling like an impatient bird. Miss Marple sat by the window, knitting half forgotten in her lap. Her mind was busy with threads of another sort, threads of time, of guilt, of opportunity. The pattern, she felt, was nearly complete. Only one final stitch remained. Outside, Sergeant Willis was already pacing the lane, glancing anxiously toward the inn where Phyllis Dane still lodged. The inspector's orders were clear. No arrest until Miss Marple gives the word. A most unusual arrangement, but Inspector Graves had learned overnight that it was sometimes safer to let the old lady think first. When Miss Marple finally stepped out into the morning light, the village square seemed to pause. Her blue hat was slightly askew, her gloves spotless, her expression serene. But her eyes held the sharp gleam of someone about to open a long-closed clock case. At the inn, Phyllis Dane sat in the small lounge, surrounded by her late uncle's documents, the will, the inventory of clocks, the account books. Her hands were steady, but her face was pale. She looked up sharply when Miss Marple entered. "Good morning, my dear," said Miss Marple, as though paying a social call. "I thought you might like some company. It's dreadful being alone with paperwork, isn't it?" Phyllis forced a smile. "I've had worse company than papers, Miss Marple." "Indeed," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Men can be so dull compared with ledgers. They rarely keep proper records." Phyllis laughed once, a small, brittle sound. "I imagine you've come to question me again." "Not at all," said Miss Marple. "Only to return something." From her reticule, she drew a small brass gear, polished to a faint gleam, the one meant for the vicarage clock. "I believe this belonged to your uncle. He sent it before he died. Quite symbolic, don't you think? A part meant to set time right again." Phyllis's hand tightened around the cup before her. He was sentimental like that. He always said time was a punishment for the forgetful. Miss Marple's tone softened. He must have been difficult to please. Phyllis gave a short, humorless laugh. "He kept lists, debts owed, mistakes made, birthdays missed. When I was 16, I borrowed money to study art. He wrote it down in his book and called it the account of folly. I repaid every shilling, but he never erased it." "I see," said Miss Marple gently. "And you thought, perhaps, to balance the books once and for all." Phyllis looked up sharply. "Are you accusing me?" "Not accusing, my dear. Understanding. I believe you loved your uncle once, but resentment is like rust on a gear. It slows everything down until the mechanism breaks. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. The clock over the mantel ticked loudly. Then Phyllis whispered, "He was going to cut me out of his will." I overheard him telling his solicitor. After all I'd done for him, he said I'd disappointed him. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "So you took his tea, as you always did, and added a pinch of something bitter." Phyllis trembled. "I didn't mean to kill him. Only to make him ill. Just enough to frighten him, to stop him from signing." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "My dear, poison doesn't recognize the difference between a warning and revenge." Phyllis pressed her hands to her temples. "I didn't mean, but when he fell, I panicked. I remembered the telegram, the clock. He told me he was keeping one set wrong for a test he was doing. I thought, if I changed it, it would look as though he'd died later. I only needed time to move the papers, the will." "And so," said Miss Marple softly, "you bought yourself half an hour of borrowed time." Phyllis's eyes filled with tears. "I was going to fix it afterward. I meant to reset everything." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That's the trouble with time, my dear. It keeps its own counsel. Once disturbed, it never quite goes back." At that moment, a firm knock came at the door. Inspector Graves entered, hat in hand. "Miss Marple," he said politely, "I thought I'd find you here." "Miss Dane, I'm afraid I must ask you to come with me to Market St. Clair." Phyllis rose, white as paper. "So it's true then, you all knew." Graves looked awkward. "It's my duty, miss." Miss Marple's voice, however, was gentle. "You might tell him, Phyllis, all of it. It will be better if you do." Phyllis turned toward the window. The red motorcar stood gleaming in the inn-yard, rainwater beading on its bonnet. "I wanted to be free of him," she whispered, "free of the ticking, the measuring. He never forgave mistakes, not in clocks, not in people. He said time must always tell the truth. But I thought, perhaps, for once, I could make it lie." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And yet it told the truth in the end. It always does." Phyllis gave a soft, broken laugh. "You would know, wouldn't you? You see everything." "Only what's already there," Miss Marple replied kindly. "The rest is merely patience." As Phyllis walked past her toward the door, the young woman paused. "Why didn't you tell them sooner?" "Because," said Miss Marple, "I hoped you might still wind the clock back yourself." Phyllis said nothing more. The door closed quietly behind her. That afternoon, the village resumed its slow rhythm, as villages do after tragedy. Mrs. Weatherby baked a cake for comfort. The vicar prepared a sermon on repentance, and Sergeant Willis told anyone who would listen that Miss Marple had solved the case by counting clocks instead of clues. Miss Marple herself sat in the little parlour, sipping tea, her expression unreadable. On the table before her lay a small envelope addressed in a careful, tidy hand. The constable had found it that morning in the clockmaker's drawer, sealed and marked to be opened only if I am gone. Inside were a few simple words: "To whom it may concern, should mischief come my way, look not to the time I died, but to the time I should have lived. The clock will tell you everything, H. Kemp." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope and placed it beside her teacup. "Very neat," she murmured. He left the truth wound tightly, ready to strike. As twilight deepened, she wandered to the churchyard. The newly repaired clock in the tower ticked softly, each second a calm heartbeat against the fading sky. Below it, fresh earth covered the clockmaker's grave. The vicar joined her quietly. "It's a sad ending, Miss Marple." "Sad," she agreed, "but also merciful. Truth told, even late, is a kind of grace," he nodded, glancing up at the clock face. "We've set it right again. It struck perfectly on the hour." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then all is well. Time, like conscience, prefers to run correctly." The bell began to toll 6. Each chime floated over the rooftops, through the still air of the village, and down to where the red motorcar stood waiting by the constable's post, its engine silent at last. That night, Back in her room, Miss Marple recorded her final note in the diary. Case closed within 3 days. Poison, cyanide. Motive, resentment and fear. Means, falsified time. Lesson: one cannot stop a clock by killing the clockmaker. She closed the book gently, turned down the lamp, and listened to the night. Somewhere far off, the church bell struck 7. The sound was soft, precise, and honest, exactly as Mr. Kemp would have wanted it. Chapter 5. The last chime. 3 days after the arrest, Willowbrook seemed to breathe again. The lanes were swept clean by a soft wind, washing lines fluttered between cottages, and the air smelled faintly of lilac and rain. Time, that fragile, invisible ruler of village life, had resumed its steady rhythm. But for Miss Marple, time never simply passed, it revealed. Each hour, each quiet observation, each cup of tea taken among gossiping neighbours, they were like gears in a great human clockwork, each turning another toward truth. On that peaceful Sunday morning, she sat on the vicarage green, knitting a pale grey shawl. The bells of St. Jude's rang the quarter hour with crisp accuracy. Across the street, Mrs. Weatherby stood in her doorway, waving cheerily. "All's right again, Miss Marple. The inspector's gone back to Market St. Clair. Says justice moves quicker when you wind it yourself." Miss Marple smiled. "Indeed. But one mustn't overwind, my dear. Things break that way." She glanced toward the clockmaker's shop, now shuttered and silent. The window signs still read H. Kemp Clocks Repaired, Time Restored. A faint breeze stirred the curtain inside, as if the spirit of the old craftsman was still adjusting some eternal mechanism. That afternoon, the vicar called upon her with the parish register in hand. "I've had a letter," he said, settling into the armchair opposite. "From the inspector. Miss Dane has confessed to everything. She's been very quiet, apparently. Says she only wanted to delay things, not end them." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I believe her. Motives are seldom pure evil, only badly thought through. A foolish girl's notion that time could be borrowed. She asked to send you something," the vicar added. "A note, enclosed in her lawyer's packet." He handed her a small folded page, the handwriting firm but tremulous. "Miss Marple, you were right. I only wanted an hour, one single hour, to make things fair again. I thought if I could change time, I could change the past. But time doesn't forgive, does it? Tell the village I'm sorry. Tell them Uncle Harold's clocks should run freely. Now, Phyllis Dane." Miss Marple laid the paper gently on the table. "Poor child," she said softly. "She mistook the cruelty of regret for the fairness of justice." The vicar sighed. "Do you think she ever find peace?" "She will," Miss Marple said, "once she learns that truth, though painful, is never quite as heavy as a lie carried 4 years." Later that evening, Miss Marple took a quiet walk through Willowbrook High Street. The sunset glowed faintly on wet cobblestones. Children's laughter drifted from the green. Yet her feet led her, unbidden, to the locked door of the clockmaker's shop. Inside, dust floated through narrow beams of light. The clocks, dozens of them, stood silent, their pendulums still. It was as though the heart of the village had stopped to rest. She found the key where the constable had left it and stepped softly inside. Her shoes made no sound on the wooden floor. For a moment she simply stood, surrounded by faces of time, gilt, brass, wood, enamel, all watching her like patient ghosts. At the back of the shop, a small workbench still held the final tools Harold Kemp had used. A jar of oil, a half-polished cog, a magnifying glass. And beneath it, in the shallow drawer, lay his notebook. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, diagrams of escapements and pendulums, but also small reflections in the margins. "Time obeys no man, only honesty. A lie alters not the hour, only the heart. Phyllis worries too much. Must speak with her soon." Miss Marple closed the book and looked around the quiet shop. "You tried to warn her," she murmured, "in your own way." A sudden breeze slipped through the cracked window, brushing across the clocks. One pendulum stirred, then another. Soon, faint ticking filled the air, hesitant at first, then harmonious, like an orchestra finding its rhythm. She smiled. "Ah, you see, Mr. Kemp. Time never stops. It only waits to be forgiven." Outside, the evening deepened. Miss Marple walked back toward the church, where Sergeant Willis was just finishing his round. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said cheerily. "Inspector says you've got quite the reputation now. Solved the case in 3 days flat." He called it a masterpiece of village reasoning. "How flattering," said Miss Marple modestly. "Though really, I only listened to what the clocks were saying." Willis laughed. "Clocks, eh? Wish my wife listened to me that closely." "Oh, I'm sure she does," Miss Marple said, eyes twinkling. "Women simply measure time differently. They notice the pauses, not the minutes." He tipped his cap and went on his way, whistling. Miss Marple watched him go, then looked up at the church tower. The great clock face gleamed pale gold in the dusk. It struck 7, each chime soft and deliberate, but tonight Miss Marple thought she heard something new in the sound, not solemnity, but balance. Time had righted itself. At supper, Mrs. Weatherby could talk of nothing but the story's ending. Imagine all that trouble over half an hour. "And to think, you knew from the start, Miss Marple." "Not quite from the start," Miss Marple said, smiling. "One never truly knows until one understands kindness, or the lack of it. Mr. Kemp was clever, but unkind in small ways. Miss Dane was foolish, but not malicious. It was their shared blindness to mercy that wound the spring to tight." Mrs. Weatherby blinked. "You do have a way of putting things." "Practice," said Miss Marple, "and an interest in tea." Later that night, she sat alone by the fire. The lamplight gleamed on her silver knitting needles, each motion calm, rhythmic, and precise. Through the open window came the faint sound of the sea, far beyond the fields, a low, eternal sigh. She thought of Phyllis Dane somewhere in a grey cell, listening to her own ticking thoughts. She thought of Harold Kemp, whose love of perfect time had led him to a very human imperfection, and she thought, too, of all the villagers whose lives had been brushed by this quiet tragedy, each of them adjusting, as clocks do, to a new rhythm after disturbance. She reached for her diary one last time and wrote, all resolved. Human nature, as erratic as any mechanism, yet always repairable if one knows where to oil and where to tighten. I have learned again that truth is patient. It waits behind every lie until someone, even an old woman, listens closely enough to hear it tick. She paused, listening to the steady tick of the mantel clock. It seemed to echo the heartbeat of Willowbrook itself, tranquil, unhurried, wise. Outside, the moon rose over the thatched roofs, bathing the village in silver. The repaired church clock struck 8, and its echoes rolled softly across the sleeping fields. Miss Marple set down her pen, smiled to herself, and whispered, "Well then, all in good time." The last chime faded into stillness.